The Lakota Sun Dance, a drum that beat without hands. Before we start, just a reminder, if you enjoy this kind of content, subscribe to the channel. Now, let's get to the video. Historical fiction. The photograph. Chicago, Illinois. September. Burton William. Story. And the glass plate. Negative up to the window, squinting through the gray light that filtered through his office windows. What he saw defied explanation. The image captured a moment during a Lakota Sun Dance ceremony, somewhere on the Great Plains. In the center of the frame stood the sacred cottonwood pole, its branches reaching skyward like supplicating arms. Around it, dancers moved in their eternal circle, their bodies painted with sacred symbols, eagle-bone whistles caught mid-breath at their lips. But it was what hung from the pole that made Story's hands tremble. A drum, suspended by rawhide tongues, rotating slowly in the wind. And according to the photographer's accompanying notes, it had been beating a steady, rhythmic pulse without any human hand touching it. Impossible, Story muttered, but the photograph told a different story. The drum surface showed the telltale blur of motion, captured in the split second of the camera's exposure. More unsettling still were the faces of the dancers below, expressions of awe and terror mingled together, as if they too were witnessing something beyond the natural world. The letter was signed by one Marcus Whitfield, a photographer who had been documenting the Western Territories for the Smithsonian Institution. His handwriting, usually precise and measured, showed signs of agitation. Mr. Sturdy, I have witnessed something that challenges everything I believed about the natural world. The enclosed photograph was taken during a Lakota Sun Dance ceremony on the Rosebud River. The drum you see suspended from the sacred pole began beating of its own accord during the ceremony's most sacred moment. I observed this phenomenon for nearly an hour. The sound was unlike anything I have ever heard, not merely the beating of hide stretched over wood, but something deeper, as if the very earth itself had found its voice. Story set the photograph down and reached for his pipe, his mind racing. The Tribunal built its reputation on factual reporting, on bringing the truth of the Western frontier to the drawing rooms of Chicago's elite. But this was something else entirely. It thought of the recent troubles with the Lakota, the tensions following the Treaty of Fort Laramie, the encroachment of settlers onto sacred lands, the government's increasingly aggressive policies toward the Plains tribes. Perhaps the story, if handled carefully, could shed light on a culture that most Americans viewed as nothing more than an obstacle to progress. Or perhaps it would simply be dismissed as the fevered imagination of a photographer too long in the wilderness. A knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," he called, quickly sliding the photograph beneath a stack of papers. His assistant, young Thomas Hartwell, entered with the morning's correspondence. "Sir, there's been another development in the Indian situation. General Sheridan is requesting more troops for the Dakota Territory." His Story nodded absently, his mind still on the impossible image hidden beneath his papers. "Thomas, what do you know about Indian ceremonies, their religious practices?" The young man looked surprised. "Very little, sir. Only what I've read in the papers. Sabbaths, rituals, mostly. Why do you ask?" "Curiosity," Story replied, though it was far more than that. He had a feeling that Marcus Whitfield's photograph would change everything, not just for the Tribune, but for anyone who dared to look beyond the surface of what they thought they knew about the world. As Thomas left, Story pulled the photograph back out and studied it once more. In the background, barely visible at the edge of the frame, he could make out the figure of a man with a camera on a tripod. Whitfield himself, capturing not just an image, but a moment when the impossible became real. The drum seemed to stare back at him from the photograph, its surface marked with symbols he couldn't read, but somehow understood, spoke of powers older than the cities and railroads that were rapidly claiming the continent. He made his decision. Within the hour, he would dispatch his best reporter westward, armed with questions and an open mind. The story of the drum that beat without hands would be told, whatever the consequence. Outside his window, the rain continued to fall on Chicago's bustling streets, washing away the dust of another day. But somewhere on the Great Plains, under an endless sky, the drum continued its ancient rhythm, calling to those who still remembered how to listen. Union Pacific Railroad, Nebraska Territory, October. He had been traveling for 3 days now, leaving behind the familiar chaos of Chicago for the vast uncertainty of the frontier. In his leather satchel lay the photograph that had started this journey, the impossible image of a drum beating without hand. The train car was filled with the usual assortment of westward travelers. Settlers clutching their meager possessions, soldiers returning to frontier posts, and businessmen seeking opportunity in the territories. Morrison had struck up conversations with several of them, carefully probing for any knowledge of Indian ceremonies or unexplained phenomena. Most responses were predictably dismissive. Indian magic, scoffed a cattle rancher from Omaha. Nothing but smoke and mirrors to frighten the superstitious. But occasionally Morrison detected something else in their voices, a hesitation, a glance away, as if they had seen or heard things they couldn't quite explain. It was from an old fur trapper named Samuel Bridger that Morrison first heard the name of the man he sought. "You're looking for Marcus Whitfield?" Bridger asked, his weathered face creasing into a frown. "That photographer fellow who's been documenting the tribes. You know him?" "No, the him. He's got a reputation for going places most white men wouldn't dare. Lives with the Indians for months at a time, learning their ways. Some say he's gone native." Bridger leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Others say he's seen things out there that changed him." "What kind of things?" Bridger was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the passing landscape. "The plains aren't like back east, son. Out here, the line between the natural and supernatural gets mighty thin. The Indians know this. They've always known it. But most white folks, we're too busy trying to tame the land to notice what's already here." As the train pulled into North Platte, Nebraska, Morrison gathered his belongings. According to his information, Whitfield was last seen heading toward the Rosebud River region, where the photograph had been taken. From North Platte, Morrison would need to arrange for a horse and supplies, then ride north into territory that was becoming increasingly dangerous for white travelers. The station was a rough collection of wooden buildings clustered around the railroad track. Morrison found lodging at a boarding house run by a German immigrant named Klaus Weber, who proved to be a valuable source of local information. "Ha, I know this Whitfield," Weber said as he served Morrison a dinner of beans and salt pork. "He comes through here sometimes, buying supplies. A strange man. Speaks some of the Indian languages, carries himself like he belongs out there. When did you last see him?" 2 months ago, maybe 3. He was excited about something, talking about a ceremony he had been invited to witness. Said it would change how people think about the Indians. Weber paused, studying Morrison's face. "You are not the first to come looking for him." This was news to Morrison. "Who else?" "Government men, army. They came through last week, asking the same questions. They seemed very interested in finding him." Morrison felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October evening. If the government was looking for Whitfield, it suggested that the photographer's work had attracted official attention and possibly official concern. That night, as Morrison lay in his narrow bed listening to the wind howl across the prairie, he studied the photograph once more by lamplight. The more he looked at it, the more details he noticed. The positioning of the dancers suggested a specific moment in the ceremony, perhaps the climax, when the spiritual energy was at its peak. The drum itself seemed to glow with an inner light, though Morrison knew this could simply be a trick of the photographic process. But it was the faces that haunted him most. These were not the savage expressions he had been conditioned to expect from newspaper illustrations and demeanor models. Instead, he saw reverence, awe, and something approaching transcendence. These were people experiencing something sacred, something that connected them to forces beyond the material world. The next morning, Morrison purchased a horse, supplies, and a rifle from the local trading post. The proprietor, a grizzled man named Jake Sutter, was reluctant to sell to someone planning to venture into Lakota territory. "You sure about this, mister? Things are getting tense out there. The Indians are angry about the new mining operations in the Black Hills." White man traveling alone. He shook his head. "I'm a journalist," Morrison replied. "I'm not here to mine or settle. I just want to find Marcus Whitfield and hear his story." Sutter studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Well, if you're determined to go, at least take some advice. The Lakota respect courage, but they also respect the proper protocol. If you encounter them, show no fear, but also show no aggression. And if they mention the sacred drum," he paused, "what about it? Listen with respect. That drum has a history that goes back generations. It's not just an instrument to them, it's a bridge between worlds." As Morrison rode north from North Platte, leaving the last vestiges of civilization behind, he carried with him not just the photograph and his journalistic mission, but a growing sense that he was entering a realm where the rules he had always lived by might no longer apply. The prairie stretched endlessly before him, and somewhere in that vastness, a drum continued to beat without hands, calling to those brave enough to seek the truth behind the impossible. Rosebud River, Dakota Territory, October. His horse was exhausted, and Morrison himself felt the weight of the frontier's isolation pressing down on him like a physical force. The photograph in his satchel seemed to pulse with its own energy, drawing him forward toward an encounter he couldn't fully imagine. It was the smoke that he noticed first, thin wisps rising from beyond a bend in the river. Morrison dismounted and approached on foot, leading his horse through the tall grass. As he crested a small hill, the Lakota camp spread out before him like something from another world. Dozens of teepees arranged in a great circle, their buffalo hide walls painted with symbols that seemed to dance in the afternoon light. Children played along the riverbank, while women worked at various tasks, preparing food, tanning hides, creating the intricate beadwork for which the Lakota were renowned. Men sat in groups, some crafting weapons and tools, others engaged in animated conversation. But it was the silence that struck Morrison most profoundly. Despite the activity, there was an underlying quiet to the camp, as if everyone was listening for something just beyond the range of hearing. Morrison had barely taken a dozen steps toward the camp when he found himself surrounded by mounted warriors. They appeared as if from nowhere, their horses moving with the fluid grace of water flowing around stone. The leader, a man of perhaps 40 years with intricate face paint and eagle feathers in his hair, studied Morrison with dark eyes that seemed to see straight through to his soul. "You seek the picture maker," the warrior said in accented but clear English. Morrison nodded, surprised by the directness. "Marcus Whitfield. I'm a journalist from Chicago. I've come to hear his story." The warrior's expression didn't change, but Morrison sensed a subtle shift in the atmosphere around them. "I am Standing Bear. The picture maker is changed. The sacred drum has touched his spirit. Are you prepared for what you might see?" Before Morrison could answer, Standing Bear gestured for him to follow. They rode into the camp together, Morrison acutely aware of the eyes upon him. But rather than hostility, a sense of curiosity and something approaching sympathy, as if these people understood the magnitude of what he was about to encounter. They stopped before a teepee that stood slightly apart from the others. Its hide walls were painted with images that made Morrison's breath catch drums, floating in the air, surrounded by dancing figures and symbols that seemed to move when he wasn't looking directly at them. "He has been waiting for you," Standing Bear said simply. Morrison dismounted and approached the teepee entrance. A voice from within called out in English, "Come in, Mr. Morrison. I've been expecting you." Inside, the teepee was dimly lit by a small fire in the center. Sitting cross-legged across from the entrance was a man Morrison barely recognized from the description he had been given. Marcus Whitfield had always been described as a typical Eastern intellectual, pale, bookish, more comfortable with photographic equipment than with people. The man before him was transformed. Whitfield's skin was deeply tanned, his hair longer and adorned with a single eagle feather, but it was his eyes that showed the most dramatic change. They held a depth and intensity that spoke of someone who had seen beyond the veil of ordinary reality. "You receive a photograph," Whitfield said, gesturing for Morrison to sit. "And like any good journalist, you came seeking the story behind the impossible image. Is it real?" Morrison asked, without preamble. "The drum, did it really beat without anyone touching it?" Whitfield smiled, an expression both sad and transcendent. "Reality, Mr. Morrison, is far more complex than we were taught to believe. Yes, the drum beat without human hands, but that's only the beginning of the story." Over the next several hours, as the fire burned low and the sounds of the camp settled into evening quiet, Whitfield told his tale. He had come west as a skeptical documentarian, intent on capturing images of a dying culture for the archives of civilization. But the longer he spent with the Lakota, the more he began to understand that what he had dismissed as superstition was actually a sophisticated understanding of forces that science had yet to acknowledge. The drum, Whitfield explained, is not just an instrument, it's a focal point for spiritual energy that has been accumulating in this place for generations. The Lakota understand that certain locations, certain objects, can serve as bridges between the physical and spiritual worlds. But how is that possible? Morrison pressed. How can a drum beat by itself? Whitfield reached into a leather pouch and withdrew a smaller version of the drum from the photograph. As Morrison watched in amazement, Whitfield placed it on the ground between them and began to sing in the Lakota language. Slowly, impossibly, the drum began to vibrate, then to produce a soft, rhythmic beating. The drum responds to intention, to spiritual energy focused through ceremony and song, Whitfield explained. As the beating continued, the Lakota have known this for centuries. They don't see it as supernatural to them. It's simply another aspect of the natural world that most people have forgotten how to perceive. Morrison stared at the beating drum, his journalistic skepticism warring with the evidence of his own senses. "Why are you showing me this? Why risk exposure?" Whitfield's expression grew serious. "Because the world is changing, Mr. Morrison. The government wants to suppress this knowledge, to reduce the Lakota to nothing more than obstacles to be removed. But what they possess, this understanding of the deeper currents of reality, could benefit all of humanity if we were wise enough to listen." As if summoned by their conversation, standing bare entered the teepee. He looked at the still beating drum and nodded approvingly. "The sacred time approaches," he said to Whitfield. "The great ceremony begins at dawn. You must decide if your friend is ready to witness what cannot be undone." Morrison looked between the two men, understanding that he stood at a crossroad. He could return to Chicago with a story that would likely be dismissed as frontier fantasy, or he could stay and witness something that might fundamentally change his understanding of reality itself. The drum continued its impossible rhythm, and in that sound, Morrison heard the heartbeat of a world far stranger and more wonderful than he had ever imagined. Dawn, Rosebud River, October. Through the teepee walls, he could see the gray light of dawn beginning to paint the eastern sky. Whitfield was already awake, sitting in meditation before the small drum that had beaten through most of the night. "Today you will see the great drum," he said without opening his eyes. "The one from the photograph. But Morrison, once you witness this ceremony, you can never again claim ignorance of what exists beyond the boundaries of conventional reality." Outside, the camp was transforming. The everyday activities of cooking and childcare had given way to something far more solemn and purposeful. Men and women painted their bodies with sacred symbols using pigments of red ochre, yellow clay, and charcoal. Eagle bone whistles, hung from leather thongs around their necks, and many wore elaborate headdresses of eagle and hawk feathers. Standing Bear approached them as they emerged from the teepee. He too was transformed, his usual practical clothing, replaced by ceremonial regalia that spoke of deep spiritual significance. The sacred pole has been prepared, he told Whitfield. The drum calls to be awakened. They walked together toward the center of the camp, where Morrison saw the scene from the photograph coming to life. A tall cottonwood pole had been erected, its bark stripped away to reveal the pale wood beneath. From its upper branches hung the drum, larger than Morrison had imagined, its hide surface painted with symbols that seemed to shift and dance in the morning light. But the drum was silent. Around the pole, perhaps 50 Lakota had gathered in a great circle. Men, women, and children of all ages stood with an air of expectant reverence, their faces turned toward the suspended instrument. Morrison noticed that several held smaller drums of their own, though these too remained silent. An elderly man whom Morrison hadn't seen before stepped forward. His age was impossibly to determine. He could have been 60 or 100, his face bearing the deep lines of someone who had lived through profound experiences. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of generations. "I am Black Elk," he said, his English heavily accented, but clear. "I am the keeper of the sacred drum's story. You, picture maker's friend, you wish to understand what you cannot see." Morrison nodded, not trusting his voice. Black Elk stood toward the drum. "This drum was made by my grandfather's grandfather, in a time when the buffalo covered the plains like grass. But it was not made by hands alone. It was made with the breath of the four winds, the tears of the sky, and the heartbeat of Mother Earth herself." As Black Elk spoke, other members of the circle began a low, rhythmic chanting. The sound seemed to come from deep within their chests, resonating with something primal and ancient. Morrison felt the vibration in his own bones, as if the very atoms of his body were beginning to align with some cosmic frequency. "The drum chooses when to speak," Black Elk continued. "It cannot be forced, cannot be commanded. It speaks only when the people's hearts are pure, when the ceremony is conducted with proper reverence, and when the spirits of our ancestors join their voices to ours." The chanting grew stronger, and Morrison noticed that some of the participants had begun to move, not dancing exactly but swaying in rhythm with the sound. Their movements were subtle at first, but gradually became more pronounced, as if they were being moved by forces beyond their conscious control. Whitfield leaned close to Morrison's ear. "Watch the drum," he whispered. "Don't look away, no matter what you see." Morrison fixed his gaze on the suspended instrument. At first, nothing seemed to change, but gradually, almost imperceptibly, he began to notice a subtle vibration in the hide surface. It was so slight that he might have dismissed it as wind, except that the morning air was perfectly still. The vibration grew stronger. The painted symbols on the drum's surface seemed to pulse with their own inner light. And then, impossibly, the drum began to sound. It started as a whisper, a barely audible thump that Morrison felt more than heard. But with each beat, the sound grew stronger, more defined. Soon it was a clear, rhythmic pulse that seemed to synchronize with Morrison's own heartbeat. But this was only the beginning. As the drum's voice strengthened, Morrison began to see things that challenged every assumption he had ever held about the nature of reality. The air around the drum shimmered like heat waves, but instead of distortion, the shimmering revealed glimpses of other times, other places. He saw vast herds of buffalo stretching to the horizon, their hooves thundering in rhythm with the drum. He saw warriors from generations past, their faces painted for ceremonies identical to this one. He saw the spirits of the dead, translucent figures who danced alongside the living participants. The drum's beating grew more complex, incorporating rhythms that seemed impossible for a single instrument to produce. It was as if multiple drums were playing in perfect harmony, each adding its voice to a symphony that spoke of the deep connections between all living things. Morrison found himself swaying with the others, his journalist's objectivity dissolved in the face of something far greater than his ability to analyze or explain. The drum was not simply making sound. It was channeling the very essence of life itself, the cosmic rhythm that connected earth to sky, past to present, the living to the dead. As the ceremony reached its climax, Morrison understood why the government might fear this knowledge. Here was a people who had maintained their connection to forces that civilization had forgotten, who possessed wisdom that could not be conquered or contained. The drum that beat without hands was not a curiosity or a trick. It was proof of a reality far more vast and interconnected than the mechanistic worldview that was rapidly claiming dominance over human consciousness. The ceremony continued for hours, the drum's voice rising and falling like the breath of the earth itself. And through it all, Morrison stood transfixed, knowing that he was witnessing something that would change him forever. When the drum finally fell silent, as the sun reached its zenith, and the circle of participants began to disperse, Morrison found himself weeping, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming beauty of what he had experienced. He had come seeking a story. Instead, he had found a truth that would haunt and inspire him for the rest of his life. For the Robinson, Nebraska, November. Confiscate all photographic materials. National security priority. War Department. Colonel James Forsyth read the message twice, his weathered face creasing into a frown. He had been expecting something like this ever since reports began filtering back from the frontier about a white man living among the Lakota, documenting their ceremonies with unprecedented access. But the phrase national security priority suggested that Whitfield had captured something far more significant than mere ethnographic curiosities. Forsyth summoned his aide, Lieutenant William Casey, a young officer who had shown particular aptitude for intelligence gathering. Casey, what do you know about this photographer fellow? Whitfield, quite a bit, sir. He's been operating in Lakota territory for nearly 2 years. Officially, he's working for the Smithsonian documenting native customs before they disappear. Casey paused, choosing his words carefully. Unofficially, there are reports that he's gone native. Some say he's been initiated into their secret societies. And why would that concern the War Department? Casey shifted uncomfortably. There have been reports, sir, strange reports, about ceremonies. Well, that produce effects that can't be easily explained. The Indians claim their sacred objects have supernatural powers. If Whitfield has documented these claims, Forsyth understood immediately. The government's policy toward the Plains tribes depended on maintaining the narrative that they were primitive, superstitious people standing in the way of progress. Evidence of sophisticated spiritual practices, especially practices that seemed to produce unexplainable phenomena, could complicate that narrative considerably. Assemble a patrol, Forsyth ordered. 20 men experienced in Indian country were going to find Mr. Whitfield and have a conversation with him. Meanwhile, 300 miles to the north, Morrison was experiencing his own crisis of understanding. He had been living in the Lakota camp for 2 weeks now, documenting not just the story of the sacred drum, but the entire culture that had produced such a phenomenon. What he had discovered challenged everything he thought he knew about civilization, progress, and the nature of reality itself. The Lakota, they have learned, possessed a sophisticated understanding of what they call the web of life, the interconnected network of energy that linked all living things. Their ceremonies weren't primitive superstitions, but practical applications of this knowledge, ways of harmonizing human consciousness with the deeper rhythms of existence. The drum that beat without hands was just one manifestation of this understanding. Morrison had witnessed other phenomena that defied conventional explanation. Healers who could diagnose illness by reading the energy patterns around a person's body. Weather workers who could influence the movement of storms through ceremony and song. And vision seekers who could access information about distant events, through spiritual practices. Your people have forgotten these abilities. Standing Bear explained to Morrison one evening as they sat by the fire. You have chosen to see the world as dead matter, governed only by mechanical laws, but the world is alive, conscious, responsive to intention and ceremony. This is what your government fears, not our weapons, but our knowledge. Morrison was beginning to understand the implications. If the Lakota possessed genuine spiritual technologies, methods for accessing and directing subtle energies, then the government's portrayal of them as primitive savages became not just inaccurate, but actively deceptive. The real threat they posed wasn't to settlers or railroad construction, but to the entire worldview upon which industrial civilization was being built. It was Whitfield who first spotted the approaching cavalry patrol. He had been developing photographs in a makeshift darkroom when he noticed the dust cloud on the southern horizon. Soldiers, he told Morrison grimly. They've come for the photographs. The camp responded with the fluid efficiency of a people who had lived with the threat of military action for generations. Within minutes, the most sacred objects, including the great drum, had been hidden in secret locations known only to the spiritual leaders. Children and elders were moved to protected positions, while the warriors prepared for whatever might come. Colonel Forsyth rode into the camp with 20 mounted soldiers, their weapons visible but not drawn. He was a career military man who had fought in the Civil War and spent years on the frontier, but even he felt the weight of the camp's collective gaze as he approached the central fire. I'm looking for Marcus Whitfield, he announced. United States government business. Whitfield stepped forward, his camera equipment conspicuously absent. I'm Whitfield. What can I do for you, Colonel? You're to come with us. Your photographic materials are to be confiscated pending a government review. On what authority? Forsyth produced the telegram. War Department. National security concerns. Morrison watched this exchange with growing alarm. He understood now that his story had implications far beyond journalism. The government wasn't just interested in suppressing information about Lakota ceremonies. They were actively working to prevent any evidence of genuine spiritual phenomena from reaching the public. Colonel Morrison interjected, stepping forward. I'm James Morrison, correspondent for the Chicago Tribune. I'd like to know what national security threat is posed by photographs of religious ceremonies. Forsyth studied Morrison with the calculating gaze of a man accustomed to evaluating threats. That's classified information, Mr. Morrison. But I'd advise you to consider carefully what kind of story you plan to write about your time here. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Morrison felt the weight of forces far larger than himself. Government policies, military objectives, the entire machinery of westward expansion arrayed against the simple truth of what he had witnessed. But as he looked around the camp, at the faces of people who had welcomed him and shared their most sacred knowledge, Morrison made a decision that would define the rest of his career. Some stories, he realized, were too important to suppress, regardless of the consequence. The drum that beat without hands had awakened more than just spiritual understanding. It had awakened his conscience. Chicago Tribune offices. December. 3 weeks had passed since his return from the frontier. 3 weeks of wrestling with how to tell a story that would inevitably be dismissed as fantasy or fraud. The photographs that Whitfield had managed to hide from the military patrol were spread across his desk, images that captured not just the ceremony of the sacred drum, but the faces of people experiencing genuine spiritual transcendence. Editor William Story had been patient, but his patience was wearing thin. Morrison, he said, entering the office with his usual brisk efficiency, the readers are waiting for your frontier story. What's the delay? Morrison looked up from his papers. William, what if I told you I had evidence of phenomena that challenge our basic understanding of reality? What if I had documented proof that the Plains Indians possess spiritual technologies that science can't explain? Story raised an eyebrow. I'd say you've been in the wilderness too long. Our readers want facts, not fairy tales. These are facts, Morrison insisted. He picked up one of Whitfield's photographs, a clear image of the drum, suspended from the sacred pole, its surface blurred with motion, despite no visible human contact. This drum was beating without anyone touching it. I witnessed it myself, for hours. Story examined the photograph skeptically. Trick of photography, or some kind of mechanical device hidden inside the drum. Morrison had expected this reaction, but it still frustrated him. William, what if it's not a trick? What if there are aspects of reality that our scientific worldview simply hasn't accounted for yet? Before Story could respond, there was a knock at the office door. A man in a dark suit entered without waiting for permission, the kind of man whose very presence suggested government authority. Mr. Morrison? I'm Agent Harrison from the War Department. I understand you recently returned from the Lakota territory. Morrison felt his blood chill. What can I do for you, Agent Harrison? We're conducting a review of certain sensitive materials that may have been obtained during your travels, photographs specifically. We'd appreciate your cooperation in turning them over. Morrison glanced at his Story, who looked increasingly uncomfortable. I'm a journalist, Agent Harrison. My materials are protected by national security supersedes journalistic privilege. Mr. Morrison, I'm sure you understand. The threat was clear, but Morrison had spent weeks preparing for this moment. I'm afraid I don't have any photographs, Agent Harrison. They were lost during my return journey. It was a lie, but a necessary one. The real photographs were hidden in a safety deposit box across town, along with detailed notes about everything he had witnessed. Morrison had learned from Whitfield's example. The truth was too important to be suppressed by government intimidation. Agent Harrison studied Morrison's face for a long moment, then nodded curtly. I see. Well, if any such materials should turn up, I trust you'll contact us immediately. He placed the card on Morrison's desk and left without another word. Torre waited until the agent's footsteps had faded down the hallway before speaking. Morrison, what the hell have you gotten us into? Morrison picked up his pen and began to write. The story of a lifetime, William. The story of a people who understand something about the nature of reality that we've forgotten, and a government that's willing to suppress that knowledge to maintain its version of progress. Over the next several hours, Morrison crafted his article with the skill of a master journalist and the passion of a man who had witnessed truth. He wrote about the Lakota's sophisticated understanding of consciousness and energy, about ceremonies that could influence the physical world through focused intention, and about a sacred drum that beat with the rhythm of the earth itself. But he also wrote about the government's efforts to suppress this knowledge, about military patrols sent to confiscate evidence, and about the systematic campaign to portray the Plains tribes as primitive obstacles to civilization rather than the keepers of ancient wisdom they actually were. When he finished, Morrison read the article aloud to Story. The editor listened in silence, his expression shifting from skepticism to amazement to concern. Morrison, Story said finally, if we publish this, we'll be challenging not just government policy, but the entire scientific establishment. Are you prepared for that? Morrison thought of Standing Bear's words about the web of life, of Black Elk's explanation of the drum's sacred purpose, of the faces of the dancers as they experienced genuine spiritual transcendence. Some truths are too important to suppress, William. The raiders deserve to know what's really happening on the frontier. The article was published on December 15, 1972, under the headline, The Sacred Drum, Evidence of Spiritual Technology Among the Secular Technology Among the Plains Indians. It created an immediate sensation, sparking debates in scientific circles, religious communities, and government offices across the nation. Some dismissed it as frontier fantasy, but others recognized the careful documentation and credible witnesses Morrison had assembled. The photographs, when they were finally revealed, provided visual evidence that was difficult to dismiss. More importantly, the article opened a conversation about the nature of consciousness, the reality of spiritual phenomena, and the wisdom that indigenous peoples had preserved despite centuries of persecution. It challenged readers to consider that progress might not require the destruction of ancient knowledge, but rather its integration with modern understanding. Marcus Whitfield, who had managed to evade government capture and continue his work documenting Lakota ceremonies, sent Morrison a letter from somewhere in the Dakota Territory. "You have done what I could not. You have brought the truth to the world beyond the frontier." The sacred drum beats not just in ceremony, but in the hearts of all who remember that we are connected to something greater than ourselves. That rhythm will continue, no matter what forces try to silence it. Morrison kept that letter in his desk drawer for the rest of his career, a reminder of the day he chose truth over comfort, wonder over skepticism, and the courage to report on realities that challenged everything his readers thought they knew about the world. The drum that beat with our hands had awakened more than spiritual understanding. It had awakened a new way of seeing, one that recognized the sacred in the midst of an increasingly mechanized world. And in the end, that may have been its greatest miracle of all. In the years that followed, Morrison's article would be cited by researchers, spiritual seekers, and historians studying the complex relationship between indigenous wisdom and modern science. The sacred drum itself disappeared from recorded history, hidden away by the Lakota to protect it from further government interference. But its rhythm continued, beating in the hearts of all who understood that reality was far stranger, far more wonderful, and far more interconnected than the dominant culture was willing to admit. The photograph that had started Morrison's journey remained as evidence, a frozen moment when the impossible became visible, when the sacred revealed itself to those brave enough to witness its truth. And somewhere on the Great Plains, under an endless sky, the ancient ceremonies continued, preserving knowledge that humanity would need more than ever in the challenging times ahead. From the personal journal of James Morrison, dated December 10, the world has changed dramatically in that time. The frontier has been closed, the buffalo herds are gone, and most of the plains tribes have been confined to reservations. The government's campaign to suppress indigenous spiritual practices has been largely successful, at least on the surface. But the truth has a way of persisting, even when driven underground. I continue to receive letters from readers who were inspired by my article to seek out their own experiences of the sacred. Scientists are beginning to explore phenomena that were once dismissed as superstition, and somewhere in the hidden places of the world, the ancient wisdom continues to be preserved and practiced. The drum that beat without hands was more than just a miraculous phenomenon. It was a symbol of humanity's forgotten connection to the deeper currents of existence. In our rush to conquer and mechanize the natural world, we have lost touch with the very forces that give life meaning and purpose. But the rhythm continues, waiting for those who remember how to listen.